So our last panel today is on mentoring. Panelists, please introduce yourselves. We're going to start with Bryan and do it in alphabetical order. So Bryan, then Darren, then Megan, and keep your introductions to 3 sentences. So short.
All right. Yeah, my name is Bryan McCloskey. I'm a faculty in chemical and biomolecular engineering at UC-Berkeley. I also have a joint appointment up at OBNL in the Energy Storage and Distributed Resources division. So my research focuses primarily on batteries, battery materials, and electrochemical systems.
My name is Darren Lipomi. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Nanoengineering and Chemical Engineering at UC San Diego. My research focuses on flexible electronics and human-machine interfaces, and maybe relevant to this discussion is I also have a podcast and a YouTube channel where we discuss a lot of the topics relevant to this panel.
My name is Megan Killian. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Medicine and Department of Orthopedic Surgery. I just started my current position right before COVID hit, but prior to that, I was assistant professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Delaware. And I'm a Michigander originally, so go blue.
As is my mom. So before we get started, I'm going to ask the panelists to answer one question, which is a very loaded question. How do you define mentoring somebody versus being their PhD or postdoc advisor? So let's start with Darren.
Sure. Mentoring and advising are really 2 aspects of the PI-student relationship. I tend to think of advising as advice. This refers to experimental design, topic selection, what courses to take, who to talk to get a job, making connections, and so forth. I think mentoring is more of a personal and philosophical concept. I would say that advising works at the level of actions, like what to do, and mentoring works at the level of values, like why are you doing it? I think it's possible to be an advisor, but not a mentor. I suppose it's also possible to have it the other way around. My PhD advisor was like this. He never told me what scholarships to apply for, what experiments to run, but he did teach me about topic selection, how to make an argument in scientific writing and speaking. Final couple thoughts. You don't ask somebody to be a mentor. It's more like a role model. Your PI could be a mentor, maybe not. Hopefully they are. It means giving a student critiques they might not want to hear, establishing connections between personal talents and possible projects. And I would say that getting a PhD can be thought of as like getting a black belt in creating knowledge, and a mentor is somebody that helps a student along those goals.
Bryan, we'll go to you. I will call on people.
I really appreciated Darren's insights there. I think that they're all entirely relevant and accurate. I think that when I think of advising, I agree that it's more about the science and focusing on how you interact and engage with all the other lab members to create knowledge. So what experiments are you going to run to prove a conclusion? Whereas a mentor, I find is more about trying to understand more personal relationships within the lab, trying to understand your career aspirations, and then implementing plans that allow you to achieve those outcomes. So they're certainly interrelated. There's no question about that as well. So I think those are my thoughts. Otherwise, Darren did a great job of summarizing the difference between the two.
Megan?
I think when I think of mentoring, I think of a little bit about like team captains and people who are kind of help the team along, but build this team, like an environment that's helpful for the group, but also for the individual. And Darren's description of this is really perfect. But I think another way of thinking about it is like the coach versus the team captain. And so your coach is your advisor who's kind of telling you what to do, and then your team captain is sort of your mentor, kind of helping you along. And your team captain could be at any stage, right? It could be someone similar level as you, maybe a little bit more senior, or it could be a peer, or someone much more senior that is like your advisor. It could be the same person, doesn't always have to be the same person. And as a PI, you can be a mentor to individuals in your group, but you could also be a mentor to people who are not in your group and people who might not even be at your institution or even in the same country as you. So like there's a lot of flexibility there, whereas advising is much more structured, performance driven perhaps, and a mentor is more long-term, developing that relationship with an individual that you want to kind of keep going for a long time.
So our fourth panelist has arrived. Mikhail, can you give a 2-sentence introduction and then answer the question about, in your opinion, what's the difference between being a mentor versus being an advisor?
Sure, yeah. Sorry that I couldn't get in for a little while, but here we are. So thanks, Andrea, for organizing and inviting me. My name is Mikhail. I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been here for almost 6 years now, so I just relatively recently got through the assistant professor process. So the question about the difference between being an advisor and being a mentor, from what I heard of this kind of the second half of the answers, I generally agree. For me, being a mentor seems like a little bit of a less formal arrangement than being an advisor. Although there's a huge amount of overlap, I think, but being an advisor has certain kind of formal professional responsibilities that maybe being a mentor doesn't. You're as an example, if you're the advisor to somebody and they ask you for a letter of recommendation, I mean, you can obviously ask a mentor for a letter of recommendation, but I think you have a much more formal responsibility in terms of what you have to write, what you have to describe, what kind of details you have to provide, how expected is it that this letter exists. And I mean, I think there's many such examples where there are formal responsibilities that an advisor has that a mentor doesn't necessarily. So a mentor can be something a little bit more informal. You can have a lot more mentors. I think having 5 advisors is probably an issue. You're going to get a lot of conflicting kind of direction and guidance, but having 5 mentors in all sorts of different areas is I think very reasonable. So that sounds like the difference to me.
So now that all of our panelists are here, I would like to make one quick comment. So all 4 of these panelists were actually recommended to be on today's panel by their students. So they truly are good mentors because they were actually nominated by people in their research group. So when they're giving mentoring advice on how to be good mentors, they're not doing it because they think they're good mentors. They're doing it because their students actually think they're good mentors. So I think that's important to recognize. Okay, so we're now going to go to questions from the audience. So starting with one from the top, in terms of mentoring or running a lab, how effective are things like annual lab retreats, writing sessions, and developing successful trainees in a lab environment? So let's go with Bryan.
Yeah, I think all of those are effective ways to help with advising and mentoring. We have a lab retreat, although this year, unfortunately, we didn't, but we have had lab retreats in the past that have been very nice, where all the lab members get to know each other, I think, a little bit more personally, and I get to participate in that as well. We have holiday parties as well that I think are very nice, getting to communicate and interact on a personal level with my students. You know, I actually don't have lab writing assignments or anything like that in my lab. I typically meet with my students on a biweekly basis, each one of them in subgroups. When we have manuscripts that we're trying to put together, I'll typically coordinate with the students on figures, on outlines for manuscripts as well. And we go through that process together. And each student, we do it a slightly different way, where depending on the level of detail that is in an original draft or outline, we talk about exactly how to get to the final, the finish line for those as well. But yeah, I think a personal relationship with each one of your students is really critical. Being empathetic, being communicative, not just positive communication, but also critical feedback on how you can improve as a student, as a professional, right? We're training professionals in the end, or how to approach problems in a professional way. I think all of that is really important when discussing, future outcomes with students.
So Megan.
I agree with that. One of the things we've started, and it ebbs and flows on how much we do this in my group, but we use Slack all the time. But one of the things we started in the Slack group is like a writing channel. And so we got then because I moved in February pre-COVID, we were already kind of familiar with Zoom and how to navigate Zoom rooms. And so we set up a Zoom writing room, and we would meet in the Zoom room to, you have your video on maybe or not, and you just sit together and write. We did that in person sometimes too, especially around the times of abstracts are due for conferences or that sort of thing, posters, feedback for posters coming up for presenting at a conference. And that is another way of kind of building in like a community side of thing and getting people together and that sort of thing. The Slack has been really helpful, I think, for us, especially in the era of the pandemic. But in addition to that, just kind of keeping in touch with people, even after they've flown the coop, so to speak, graduated, moved on. People still stick around and will pop in there every once in a while. So that's kind of fun. I think that kind of answers along the questions.
Yeah.
There, we don't do retreats, although I've thought about it. I've wanted to do that, but we do have like lab meetups. Socially distanced now, but we'll meet up every once in a while to say hi in person.
So kind of on that, following up on this, how did you develop your lab culture, from your initial starting point? And do you have a philosophy of lab culture? So I'm going to let everyone answer this. So we'll start with Darren.
Sure. So this is an idiosyncratic thing. When my lab started, I had 4 grad students and a postdoc over the first year. My postdoc was basically my age, and 2 of my grad students were older than me. So I think it started out where I was kind of like one of the group, and like as a result, I ended up being a lot closer personally with my students than most of my colleagues are, and that has kind of continued now, although less so my 9th year in. And this might be to a fault. I heard somewhere that we're supposed to preserve the mystique or professional distance with our students, and that's take it for what it is. But grad school and research is like unlike a normal job in that it's such a personal enterprise. I like the students to know that I'm with them and feel their ups and downs. You have to give a little and be open in order to have your students trust you. I have a lot of history of struggles with anxiety, and I tend to share them with students when they come to me with their problems. That they're having in the lab and personally. And I think that part of establishing a group, like a culture of mentorship, is establishing a climate where it's okay for older students to be mentors of younger students too. And what you're doing is trying to create a climate of trust and openness. And I think it starts with the PI, but it can't really be unidirectional. It has to be, everyone has to be open and trusting with each other. I think there's a risk that eroding professional distance hurts one's ability to be critical, but I think it's less of a problem. It's less of a problem if the values that you're striving for are trust and openness as opposed to uncritical cheerleading and flattery. Because after all, like even outside of academia, it's not the job of a friend to tell you what you want to hear.
Bryan?
I agree with Darren. Again, over time, I think that my mentoring and advising has evolved. Initially, I had 3 graduate students in my group, my first cohort. And yeah, they were maybe a couple years younger than I was, maybe 3 or 4 years, something like that. And they were a little younger than me at that point, but we were quite close. It was 3 students. I was able to pop into the lab, talk to each one of them on a daily basis, where I got feedback from them. We were building up a lab together, and so I felt that it was critical to be in very constant communication with them about all the different happenings in the lab on a given day. But then as more students join the lab, so now I have roughly a dozen students in my lab. As more students join and as you have established those capabilities in your lab, I find that my senior students can help with advising. So I like meeting in subgroups. And the reason for that is that senior students in my lab offer a unique perspective from someone who actually is working in the lab, now that I don't tend to do any of my experiments anymore, right? So, or I don't do any experiments in the lab. My students do the experiments. So I find that my senior students are really helpful in helping advise younger students as well. And I like having them all in the same room communicating to each other about all these different topics. And you just don't get that initially, right? Where they're just 3 students who might be working on separate projects. Of course, they can still talk to each other, but I found that I needed to invest a lot more time initially to get everyone up to the, onto the same page and build the lab up accordingly.
Mikhail?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of a bunch of questions here, and I think maybe the answers could be very broad. Kind of the concept of lab culture, I think, is very interesting, because lab culture, like any organizational culture, is extremely important, but also relatively difficult to build, I think. And oftentimes, as you build it kind of organically rather than top down. I will say that I have seen some groups have very effective expectations documents that students can read even when they're coming in, and can reference, as they're going on, that kind of explain the expectations that the advisor has of the students and postdocs in the group, kind of what's expected of mentees on a regular basis. Overall, what's required to graduate, for example, roughly from your group, how to prepare group meeting talks and so forth, and then expectations of the advisor. What can you expect of of your advisor. How quickly does the advisor get back to you? What do you expect in terms of letters? What do you expect in terms of informal mentorship and so forth? I actually think that if you can make this kind of document, it's really wonderful. And there are a lot of good examples online. I still haven't. It's been 6 years, and every year I want to do it, and every year I don't because I run out of time and it takes a lot of thought and effort. But every year I think this is the year that it's going to happen. So I really recommend that. One thing that I think that I did do a good job of, and that I recommend, is creating a lab culture where people want to help each other. When people want to help each other with their experiments, they want to help each other write, they want to help each other prepare for conferences, and develop professionally, even prepare for interviews once you're getting ready to leave and so forth. And there are many ways to do this, and probably I don't know a lot of them, but one thing that I did early on that I was happy about is explicitly explain to everybody in the group, in group meetings and in individual meetings, that in our group, we strive very hard to give each other credit for work that's done, even if it's small, even if it's informal, even if it's just something where you help somebody out. And there are many examples of this. One is, of course, authorship on paper. So we explicitly say up front that if you made a you took your time away from your own work and you made a contribution to somebody else's, for example, you helped build a setup, or you gave a lot of advice, or you helped with a lot of the writing process, that you will be an author on papers. And so being kind of a little bit generous with authorship on papers and conferences while staying within the bounds of kind of normal ethical responsibilities, I think is really valuable and creates this kind of expectation that your contributions, if you make them, will always be recognized. And I think that's really helpful. Similarly, sometimes you have a kind of a new student or a new postdoc who gives, let's say, a group meeting talk or a conference talk, and occasionally maybe they didn't quite internalize this culture and they didn't give the appropriate level of recognition. Maybe they thanked some people in the acknowledgements, but they didn't explicitly say how somebody really helped them out a lot. So oftentimes after something like that, I have a conversation with the person just to kind of push them in the future to give a little bit more credit and a little bit more and be a little bit more generous. And I think overall over the years, that really helps build this kind of collaborative type of environment. I also think in terms of culture, it's important for everybody in the group to be on the same page with communication. So we had an earlier discussion about different modes of communication, in person, when we could, Zoom, Slack, and so forth. And I think Slack in particular, which is something that we use in our group, is really an interesting medium. It's very helpful in a lot of ways. It cleans up your mailbox. It enables faster communication. It does a lot of good things. But one thing that's kind of idiosyncratic with things like Slack is that it's simultaneously synchronous and asynchronous, right? So it feels like a little bit of a chat. And so you have the expectation that you send a message and you should get a message back and you should respond right away. But at the same time, a lot of groups essentially use it to replace email. And some of us work at really odd times. So I'll sometimes send a message late at night or over the weekend. And I think it's really important to communicate early on to anybody who is joining your group and over again that this can be used as both types of media. And so you shouldn't, just because you get a message right away, at some odd hour or while you're working, doesn't mean that you are obligated to drop everything and respond right away. You should view it as an asynchronous medium like email, where people respond when they can, but then occasionally it can become a synchronous medium when both people are online and it's a little bit like a chat. And so I think conveying those expectations and kind of explicitly talking about it rather than letting it kind of seep through the group, really, explicitly telling people what you expect and what these tools should be used for, I think helps, so that people kind of understand the group culture right away and understand the expectations right away.
Yeah, Dr. Katz's point. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, Megan.
Dr. Katz's point of the synchronous and asynchronous medium of Slack and email, I think, is really important. So I do have one of those lab onboarding documents, and in it, I say very clearly what my expectations are of the trainees in the group and the staff and undergrads and everybody. Like, we're all on the same page, literally. And then what their expectations of me can be. And so I give them a little bit of insight in writing of what my personality is like and what I expect, as well as when they can expect to hear from me in an email or on Slack, what my expectations are of respond time. Like, for example, if it's during the normal work day, between, let's say, some of my students like to work really late into the evening and some like to work really early. So I'll say, try to be available for other people to get in touch with you between the hours of 11 and 3. That way, if you need something, someone else is around and can help, or something along those lines. And so that's very clearly written out. And then I also have in that document the sort of nitty-gritty stuff of what safety tests you need to take to work in the lab, et cetera. But I think what's really important in that document is that explicit nature of what the expectations are, because I think, and when I was a trainee, I think I made a lot of assumptions about what my expectations were of my advisor or my mentor, and then what their expectations were of me, and that might not always have matched. And so I think the other thing that I do in the lab is annual or yearly planning meetings, which are modeled after the DePace model established at Harvard. Angela DePace at Harvard, she had a really nice paper in Molecular Cell on this, describing it. And we do these actually like 2 to 3 times a year. And it's basically like, what are your research goals? What were your goals from the last cycle? And did you accomplish those goals? And how do we reframe those goals? And as your advisor or your mentor, how do I help you reach those goals, both research-wise and professionally? So sometimes that might be that the student or the postdoc wants to find an industry job. And so, writing a grant is probably not going to be as useful to them as maybe getting training in a certain technique that would be useful for a career that they want to pursue. And so we try to line up trainings in those areas that would be helpful for them to reach their professional goals as well as their research goals at the time. And so in that yearly or bi-yearly or tri-yearly planning meeting, we also sort of reestablish what our boundaries are between each other. And I think Darren's, Dr. Lipomi's point of, this kind of breaking down those barriers between the PI and the trainees is really important. But I can say as a woman, I try to keep those barriers up a little bit, especially a woman that's a similar age, just because I want to make it's what I'm more comfortable with. But it's all personal preference. And I think if you make sure that those boundaries are clear, that is what is what's most important for your trainees as well as for yourself.
Doesn't say anything else to add. If not, I have.
Yeah, Andrea.
Yes.
I want to say one more thing. So Mikhail mentioned that there's a big activation barrier to making this document, this like onboarding document. I actually have a video lab manual because I felt the same thing. It was a lot easier for me to make a PowerPoint slide, PowerPoint deck, and then record myself at the first group meeting of the year presenting it, and then making that video available to my group in subsequent years, and then maybe adding an addendum. Actually, mine is publicly available, so anyone can see it. But yeah, it's one kind of shortcut that you don't have to sweat over every piece of prose that goes in a written document if it's just spoken, because people have a way of sort of understanding what comes out of somebody's mouth in a way that if it were written down, it would be annoying. So that's what I have to add.
That's a really good point, because I have rewritten so many parts of that document because of miscommunication. So I love that idea.
Yeah, I was going to toss out Mikhail. I can send you mine. I've sent it to a lot of people. So.
I have many examples. I just have not yet quite synthesized, and that's my fault. And then we all have our bandwidth and our limits. And then I guess I reached mine sometimes.
Yep. Okay.
I actually want to follow up on this on this discussion a little bit. I thought of something that I think is valuable. So this kind of relates to the lab culture a little bit, but even more to the kind of the way that the advisor behaves toward it, or is able to behave kind of in a group setting, which is there's this interesting kind of push-pull thing, or a needle to thread between, you know, being able to be honest and give serious critique, both scientifically and on presentation, and on, you know, how the students and postdocs and you know, collaborate with each other and everything else, and at the same time being very supportive and wanting to, you know, and making it very clear that you want them to succeed and so forth. And I think being thoughtful at how you kind of navigate those kind of two axes is important, because they could be, if you're not careful, they can be in opposition, right? You can have a situation where if your goal is to be kind of infinitely supportive, that could start taking away from your ability to be critical and to provide feedback and to say when something isn't going well. But I don't think it has to be that way. And so I think that's an important thing to kind of think about, because I think it's possible to communicate, and this requires a lot of effort and over again in individual meetings and public meetings and so forth, in group meetings, communicate how important it is for the advisor, for the students and the postdocs and other members of the group to succeed, how much the advisor wants everybody in the group to succeed. And because you want them to succeed long-term, professionally, personally, to such an extent, it's all, you know, it's then your job to be critical when this comes up. And so, in other words, you know, there are different ways of, for example, delivering criticism. One way is, you did this thing wrong, how could you do it wrong? And that's probably not healthy at all, right? Or another way to deliver criticism is, hey, if you do this way, you will be able to, you know, succeed in the future in this manner, in this manner, in this manner. You know, you'll be more likely to do well. You'll be able to do better in the future. You'll be able to work to collaborate, be a better collaborator in the future if you, for example, you know, give appropriate credit and you're kind of exceedingly kind in your emails. I mean, there's many examples of this, but I guess my point is that it's worthwhile to be thoughtful about how you navigate this these two kind of issues. And there is an appropriate balance that I think you can strike, where you're allowed to be, you allow yourself to be critical and to provide feedback and to provide it right away, and to not have to worry about how it's going to be received, because your group members know that you have their best interests at heart.
Andrew, could I follow up on that as well? Mikhail makes some great points here. I think it's also important to listen to your students and be able to take criticism, because I certainly am not a perfect advisor or a perfect mentor, and I want to improve as well. And understanding that, I think, really is important as well. And so listening to your students, listening to you know, how you can be more supportive of them in certain aspects, I think is really important. And that takes building trust, being able to talk in an open way, not just me giving criticism to my students, but them providing criticism to me as well. How I can help them in a more effective fashion, I think is really important too.
So that's actually one of the questions. Do any of you actually have formal mechanisms where your students can give you feedback? I mean, I'm not talking about like the box in a supermarket where there's, you know, comment cards, although that would certainly work. But any other mechanisms established?
The DePace model that I use has a feedback component to it, and the whole framing of the yearly or tri-yearly planning meeting is that the trainee leads the meeting, and so they lead with feedback to me. And the idea, the description of the way that it's executed is that it's open and there's no consequences for the feedback that you give. So at least 3 times a year we're talking about those types of things.
Any other, Bryan?
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, actually at the departmental level, we've instituted yearly annual progress reports where we talk about this, how we can improve the advisor-advisee relationship. And so every single student now needs to have that conversation with their advisor in our department at least once a year. I haven't done this yet, but my students have requested that I provide a formal mechanism through a survey on a yearly basis as well. And so I'll work with my students here in the coming months to construct that survey. It'll be an anonymous survey where they can provide feedback like this too. But this is something that we've talked about, and I appreciate Mikhail's comments about running out of time. It does take some time and effort to do this, right? And so it just hasn't been done yet. Yeah.
So Bryan, I can send you survey questions because I've done it for 10 years.
That'd be great. And so professors in our department have done this as well. But yes, any feedback you can give would be great.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I have an open text box, and my students have actually given me really good advice on not just changes for me, but changes for the department that have also been implemented. So it's been a really good way of also getting other types of advice.
And so the reason that we have this yearly report is, our students have organized a yearly climate survey report in our department where there's a survey sent to all of our students in the department, and this was feedback that was provided by the students themselves to us that they would like this, and so that's what we did.
So following up on something that Megan said, so I'm sorry to cut you off, Darren, but we're way behind.
Yeah.
I want hands raised on this one. So have you as PIs required your trainees to develop and discuss with you individual development plans? So hands raised if it's a yes. Okay. Yeah, kind of. Okay. Have you found them to be effective? So raise your hand if it's a yes. Wow. So nobody's found them to be effective. Okay. So seeing as they're required by the NIH and NSF and students tend to ask for them. So let's start with Darren. So why have you only found it to be effective?
Sure. I don't have a great answer here. I mean, part of it seems very, it's kind of a boilerplate, template. I tend to get a lot more out of very long individual meetings with students than the written IDP.
Okay, Megan?
Yeah, so because of the requirement of doing the formal IDP, like the AAAS version of that through the grad program at Delaware, mine evolved to the DePace yearly planning meeting. And I think that is more valuable because of the feedback aspect and the planning, the personalized aspect, because the questions are so much more open-ended and the IDP feels a little bit more constrained or prescribed. So I think that they go together, and it's kind of like all what we've been talking about, that there's not one fix for things. And I think you have to find what works for you as a mentor of those tools that exist to help your trainees be successful. And the IDP might be really good for somebody who might not know exactly what they want to do and is trying to identify a career path or explore new directions. But it might be completely useless to somebody who knows what exactly they want to do and is not going to budge from that. And so, or it might be useful for them too to help figure out what do they need to do to get there. And so I think being open to new tools and trying them out, I think one of the things that I've learned over the last 5 years is there are some things that work for some trainees and some things that don't, and they're not the same. And so you have to do this individualized plan, which has been brought up by some of the other panelists, that it makes the mentoring side of things a lot more hard in the sense that it just takes more time, but it's much more valuable for the trainees to do that.
I'm in general a little bit skeptical of the more is better thing, because I mean, in principle, you can find you can develop an individual, like a plan, and you can develop like a feedback mechanism, and 3 feedback meetings a year, and so forth and so forth. And I feel like if you eventually you run out of or everybody runs out of patience with you, right? You're expecting feedback, n times a year, in this form, and this form, and this form. So I really agree with Megan that, like, come up with something that works for you, where you are getting useful feedback, and the students feel like they have a say, and then anything additional, just because something sounds good, like it sounds nice that I should add, this extra reporting mechanism, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a net positive, just because it could be a distraction, or it can be something that the students feel like they're also obligated to do, where they didn't before. And I think faculty have that as well, right? There's constantly efforts by the department and the college and the university to do things better, and usually that means some sort of additional, form to fill out, some sort of additional document to write and read, or training to do. And unless it's done very thoughtfully and in context, I'm not necessarily sure that these things are always better than not having them, even if individually they're all good ideas and are well done. So I don't know.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about culture. And obviously one component of culture is just everybody's innate personalities and the different perspectives that they bring to the group. So when hiring PhD students, postdocs, undergrads, staff technicians, how do you evaluate personalities from, a piece of paper? So we'll start with Bryan.
Yeah, you really can't. That's the bottom line. I think that when we undergo the placement process of students in our department, the students are requested to reach out to a certain number of potential advisors. They have communications with the advisors. They then are asked to reach out to the students in the lab, talk to the students in each lab that they're interested in. And then the students in the lab typically provide feedback to me about each individual student who is a prospective that could join our lab. And so I think that the selection process kind of occurs organically in that sense, where if a student just does not fit well with the culture in our lab, or if the communication is poor, if there is a lot of communication between those students and the students in my lab and myself, then we can make informed decisions about whether that student should be in our lab or not. So certainly, I wouldn't say that during the interview process we'd only look at an application. There'd have to be some formal back and forth after that in order to establish whether the personality fit for the lab and the way that they think about problems is effective and would be a good fit in our lab.
So would one other person like to answer this question? No volunteers?
Sure.
Okay.
So yeah, I agree with Bryan that it's very difficult, and I think I certainly have not come up with any good way to unambiguously figure out somebody's personality from a piece of paper, or even from an interview and some phone calls, and figure out if they're a perfect fit or not. But at least one of the things that I settled on that's working okay is once I decide to interview a potential student or postdoc in the group, I send them pretty explicit instructions from what I'm looking for. Actually, this is quite important. I think these interviews where you just say, hey, let's do a call, and then you talk about something, I think is not typically very effective, because some people don't know what you're expecting from them, and therefore will not necessarily put their best foot forward. But I send them pretty explicit instructions from what I expect from them, and what I usually expect from them is about a 20-minute talk about something technical that they've done, whether it's research in the past or a project or or something from their job or something else. And I tell them very explicitly that I'm looking for a certain amount of time. Usually it's going to be 20 minutes. For a postdoc candidate, it's going to be a little bit longer, 45 minutes maybe, and that I'm going to interrupt a lot with questions. So essentially it's going to be more of a kind of conversation and a discussion that's scaffolded by what they're presenting. And I also tell the perspective, I tell the candidate really what I'm looking for. And what I'm looking for is how you think about the work that you've done. I want to understand the skill set that you bring. I want to understand what you did compared to, as opposed to your advisors or your collaborators, and how the work that you've done fits within that sphere. I want to understand kind of how you approach problems. I kind of have a list that I provide the students. And at least, it's very imperfect, right? Because people have different levels of experience. It's particularly difficult to compare somebody who had, 2 years of undergraduate research to no undergraduate research, and, a job that they had, or a project or a course project. But the general idea is to get have like an active discussion that kind of gets to how the student thinks, and whether or not you'll be able to easily, from the beginning of the time of the candidate in the lab, whether or not you'll be able to have these kind of positive but critical conversations about technical issues and about goals and so forth, because that's also how you progress in the lab. That's how you progress in science. Here you ask a lot of technical questions, you try to get to the bottom of things, and so I want to kind of simulate that as much as possible during the interview process, but kind of in a positive environment where the person understands what's expected of them, to try to find that match. Again, I don't think it's super successful, but it's better than not doing it, in my experience.
So we have time for 2 more questions. So the first one is related to how do you mitigate the knowledge loss that occurs when students and postdocs leave the lab? Because unlike a conventional company where your goal is to keep your employees, right? In a university, your goal is to have 100% turnover every 5 or so years. So Megan, why don't you kick off this conversation?
Yeah, this is a challenge for sure. I think having somebody in the lab that are planning for your next hire to overlap with your previous one, so that skill transfer can happen, is important, but it's often difficult, especially if a student or a postdoc were to leave more abruptly. You could also hire someone who's a more consistent member of your lab, like a lab technician, if you can afford it, to help with that that side of things. Honestly, in the beginning, it's you teaching people a lot more, and then that overlap between trainees can help with transitioning that knowledge. That is so far what works, but ultimately, like starting at a new institution, hiring somebody with institutional knowledge was really helpful for me here at the University of Michigan.
Darren?
There are some basic tactics, like Megan mentioned, like overlap, but also video SOPs, so video standing operating procedures. In real life, honestly, for me, it's probably going to sound weird, but we've switched topics so many times that the topic that I got tenure on the basis of is really kind of a minority part of what my group does now. And we've probably had like 3 major research thrusts in the group, and the projects are pretty different. It does lead to a lot of, to occasionally an annoying scenario where somebody has not read a couple of key papers from previously in the group's history. And we, I'm embarrassed to admit that we have some pieces of orphaned equipment in the lab that, something went wrong with 4 years ago and nobody in the lab knows how to fix it, which is really annoying, but it does happen. So there's kind of the ideal scenario and what actually happened in my career so far, and that's sort of how it's been.
So 2 follow-up questions, and then I'm going to give everyone a chance to make kind of some final thoughts. How do you decide how many people you can manage in your research group? And how do you decide like what the distribution is between, grad students, undergrads, again, staff members, postdocs, so basically how have you decided what size and also what the composition of your research group should be? We'll start with Bryan.
Yeah, it's, I think driven maybe in majority by funding and where you can actually get funding. Which funding agencies are well connected in your institution. So, for example, at Berkeley, I have a joint appointment with LBNL, and so a lot of my funding comes through the Department of Energy. And so I found that at LBNL, there are a lot of principal investigators, staff, scientists up there that are working on lithium-ion batteries, and so my group has naturally kind of focused more on lithium-ion batteries than I would have if I joined another institution where I may be doing something similar to, what my environment would allow me to do most effectively. I think, right now I'm at a dozen students or so in my group, and I really like that number. The group doesn't feel gigantic. It doesn't feel small. Everyone is communicating. There are many different projects that are ongoing, so a lot of different capabilities that have been developed by my students. I hope that, I'm successful in generating funding that can allow a group of that size to continue, because I think it's a really nice size for my students. I think that they're really doing well, and there's a lot of communication that happens around that size amongst everyone in the group. Initially, how I picked or how I selected projects and students, I wanted to do things that my skill sets would allow me to tackle quickly, because I knew that tenure was likely going to be based on productivity and outcomes related to student success. So papers I thought were quite important there. And so I focused more on what I did in my postdoc, but maybe extending in a couple different areas, trying to stay at the state of the art in those areas initially. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Darren, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So Darren.
Okay, pressure. So I think my ability to be an effective mentor maxes out at about 8 graduate students. I've had as many as 11. I have 11 grad students and postdocs right now. I think that's a little bit too much for me, especially because as you get more advanced in your independent career, some funding opportunities come by that you supply, parts of the proposal to, but maybe they're not exactly what you would be doing if you had complete. If your funding sources were completely aligned with what you wanted to do. So that ends up maybe being like half of my support. And then a couple of, people are necessarily working on stuff that pays the bills. And, part of me thinks if I could just sort of retreat a little bit, have 4, great graduate students working on exactly, the work that I wanted to do, and my funding was entirely aligned with exactly that project, that would kind of be the ideal scenario. Undergraduates, I have a lot of undergraduates. I've had as many as 18 undergraduates in the lab. I think that there are some rote tasks, particularly in some of the more like organic chemical work that we do, and some types of measurements that graduate students probably shouldn't spend a lot of their time doing, and undergraduates are happy to turn the crank for a year until they get enough experience to have more independence. So visiting scholars, I've had 1 or 2. They've been at any given time, and they've been pretty good. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, so with that, I want to give everyone an opportunity to give kind of a closing piece of advice to our attendees, like a 2-minute closing piece of advice. So I'm going to let Megan go first.
Yeah, so I think the things that have struck me the most about mentoring a group or advising a research group is having that clear communication and shared expectations within that group, and being open to those expectations evolving over time, depending on the makeup of your group and their expectations as well. The other thing that Dr. Finley mentioned this morning in her keynote, the culture is important. And as the PI of the group, you have a say over what that culture can be, but you aren't necessarily only one that's making that culture. And so the people who join your group, who are drawn to your group, really help to set that. And you can also help to frame that and cultivate that culture. And so being a part of it, being active in that group can certainly help. And one of the things as a new PI that I think has helped to reinforce this a bit is taking that step back and trying not to get so caught up in what I have to do right now to be successful and have a long-term or have a sustainable program. That's really important, and I need to do that to be successful for my mentees. But also, like, taking a step back and saying what's important for kind of like the group that I'm growing, and what are their needs, and how do they align with what direction I'm going. And so taking a pause to reflect on that big picture framing of not just your scientific research, but also the culture that you want to cultivate in your group is really important in those early years.
Mikhail?
Yeah. So I think one closing thought I had was that I found it to be really helpful to kind of be transparent about my job to my group members. And just my process in general, because I think for many reasons. One is it just helps build trust, so that the group understands what it is that you do and how you do it. One is because it helps build understanding. You're not this mystical figure, that sits on a hill and tries to and provides guidance, but there's a process to it. Another is because it helps demystify the university. So, for example, if I learned something in a faculty meeting, about how some process or rule came to be, explaining the reasoning to the group members is really helpful, because they don't feel like arbitrary rules are being pushed down on them. I also think it's really useful for kind of a bit of venting, right? Like, this is a very stressful job. Sometimes you don't have anybody to talk to about it, right? And what's going on. And if your group understands how grants work and how long it takes to write them and how you write them and what the administrative process is like and where that funding comes from and the chance of success and what it's like if somebody applies to you and you don't have funding for them and you have to say no, and what it's like when you get a deluge of emails that you only respond to a third of them. Like, just understanding, being reasonably transparent about what the job is like and what you try to do and what you prioritize and how various rules and policies are made. I think it's broadly helpful for everybody. I really think it's helpful for the group members to feel like they're a part of the team and that you're a part of their team and you're on their team. But then also I think it's helpful for my mental health personally. So I think it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
Bryan?
I think Megan and Mikhail have captured my thoughts here as well. Effective communication is really important. Expectations in the lab, which establish the lab culture as well. I would just add, to be empathetic, listen to your students, listen to the criticism and the feedback that they provide, and try to always keep their thoughts in mind when you take action in one way or another.
Darren?
Sure. A really concrete thing that I started doing about 4 years ago was having a roundtable discussion at the end of every group meeting, where everybody gave everyone gives every week 1 to 2 minutes of what they've been doing, something that they've learned that might help others, and then critically something that somebody in the group did that they observed another group member helping another group member, or helping themselves, or sorry, helping the person who's speaking, and giving them a shout out in front of everyone. I think that has done a lot to increase morale and openness. And one time in particular, we did this at a group retreat in Big Bear, and it was probably after midnight or something, and we were all sitting around in this rented cabin, and something came up during this roundtable that this was about 4 years ago, where there was an impression by some members of the group and some members from outside the group that our group was kind of not perceived as being very welcoming to newcomers. And it was really hard for me to hear that. I thought, everything is great. We have a great climate, a great culture. But I didn't sleep that night or the next night, and probably not the next night either. And I took some steps, you can email me after if you want to talk more about this, but I took some steps that over the next several months and years and so forth to really try to improve this. We kind of had a monolithic personality disorder happening in the lab, and I was called out on it. I didn't think it was something that I did, but it was something that, as the PI, was this culture, this aspect of the culture that I didn't intend on fostering, but somehow happened. And I think that we're past that now. So I think that kind of self-correcting mechanism is really important.
Great. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for being wonderful. So I'm now going to go through basically and answer all of the rest of the questions, whether or not they're related to this panel or not, in the final 15 minutes. Obviously, the panelists can stay if they want, but they don't necessarily need to stay while we kind of knock out about 15 questions. My video has been turned off. I think the host disabled my video permanently, so I can't turn my video on at all, but maybe, there we go. I got disconnected. I'm back again. Okay, so we're just gonna head right down through all these questions on Slido. Going in order from Jackie. Early in your career, is it better to apply for grants as a PI or as a co-PI with some senior professor as PI to increase chances of success? So I think it depends on the agency. So some agencies like NIH, if you get a grant and with a senior PI, then you're no longer considered early career. So if you apply as a single PI, then you have your early career investigator status. So it's important to look at the grant rules to make sure you maximize your chance of success and you don't lose things like your early stage investigator status, which is like your ticket. Like, don't lose that. That's super important. Whereas other agencies like NSF, or DOD, they don't really have that. Also, leverage your more senior investigators to give you like a foot in the door at a lot of the DOD agencies. So they don't necessarily need to be co-PI, but they can make introductions for you. Okay, so then for those of us who are starting to feel tired by our academic journeys, can you speak to the myth that one needs to work all the time as an assistant professor to get tenure? How many hours do you or did you work during the different phases? For me personally, that was highly cyclical. So for example, if there was a deadline coming up for a proposal, my hours would significantly increase, but then, after the proposal passed, it could decrease. I discovered during my second year that if I wasn't getting at least 7 hours of sleep a night, the work I did the next day didn't really count because my brain was just non-functional. So at least for me personally, I get 7 hours of sleep every night because that's just my bar. Because otherwise, I couldn't even do things like write my bio sketch, which is basically my CV. And if you can't even write your bio sketch, which is just writing about yourself, then it doesn't really matter. Mikhail?
Yeah, I
Oh,
just want
you're
to briefly chime in here because there's a myth and a counter myth, and only one of them is, I think, actively discussed on, for example, social media. So there's this myth that came from old academic culture that yeah, you have to work like 100 hours a week, and if you're not working like a complete maniac and not doing anything else, you will not get tenure and you will fail, and that's kind of self-evidently false, right? And many people succeed without working kind of completely inordinate, insane amounts, and manage to have people manage to have a life and relationships and everything else. But there's also a counter myth because of that. I think especially on social media platforms, I see it on Twitter a lot. There's a bit of a counter myth now where people sort of give arbitrary cutoffs and say, I work 35 hours a week and I'm very successful and everything is totally fine. And like some people can do that, and if you can, that's awesome and you should do it and it's wonderful. I can't. I physically can't. And I think the propagation of this myth that it's you can be as successful at let's say 35 hours a week of work and nothing else as any scientist, as any super productive scientist, I think is also harmful, because I think it kind of breeds some imposter syndrome. People say, well, when I work 38 hours a week, I can't be I'm not able to get as much done as these other people, and yet people are telling me that I don't have that this is how hard I need to work. And so I think like people are different, and also academic work, it's very difficult to assign time to it. Like when I'm on Twitter, kind of messing around, but among scientists and sometimes talking about science, am I doing work? I don't know. And that's the case for a lot of things. If I'm kind of casually reading a paper at night or watching a basketball game, and then also doing a little bit of something on the side. So my point is, I think like you definitely should not just work and do nothing else in your life. I think that's really unhealthy. And if you don't sleep, that's very unhealthy. But also if somebody tells you that, you can do everything that anybody else can in, a 38-hour week or in a 40-hour week, I think that's also a little bit toxic, because some people can't, and I know I can't. And if you tell people that you can, you're telling them that they're not smart enough and they're not good enough to be able to do that. And I think that's just also not super healthy. So like these two myths, I think, are kind of problematic.
No, I would totally agree, which is why I say it's very cyclical. Also my work, and as another speaker said earlier, also like Katie said earlier, it's a matter of learning how to say no. I've gotten a lot better at saying no since I got older, and a lot better at deciding what things I actually want to spend time on doing. Like Stacy brought out in her keynote this morning, the things I decide I want to do, I choose them judiciously. Like this workshop today, right? Like this was 8 hours of my week today, right? Like that's a solid chunk. If I only worked 35 hours this week, which is not a thing, or like this would be a large percentage of that. But I think this is really important. So I'm willing to do that. Yeah, Megan?
I just wanted to follow up with that a little bit. So most universities have subscriptions to National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, which is facultydiversity.org online. And they run a boot camp. That's a semester-long boot camp about making a plan. But some of the things that they teach in this is like setting up those boundaries, learning how to say no, figuring out what your work day's like. When are you most productive for writing? Maybe it's in the morning, maybe it's in the evening. It doesn't matter. Just figure that out, try it, do an experiment to see what works, and then iterate from there. And I think if your university has a subscription to that, take advantage of it, give it a try. They also have videos and stuff like that online that can help.
Did you email your contacts at the institution you were applying to? I'm going to put in parentheses for faculty positions. Is this recommended to get interviews? So I didn't email people at the institutions I was applying to, but I know my postdoc advisor did. And I think this gets to, it's really important that your advisors are your advocates. After I got interviews, I emailed thank you letters to everybody I interviewed with. And then I kept those dialogues going, especially through the negotiation phase of the offer. So I could continue to kind of get like behind the scenes information about where they were in the interview process, right? Because you interview, but they interview other people. So are they still interviewing? Are they voting? Are they making decisions? So all of that's really important information. And actually probably the most useful person at USC was actually the department administrator. So a staff member. Department staff know everything. She was amazing. So again, that gets to something Michael said in the previous panel, be nice to everybody. Everybody can be your ally. So super important. So what types of new faculty support often exist?
Did Andrea just freeze for somebody else or just me?
Yeah, she did freeze.
All right. So
Yep. So I'm going to turn off my video.
we can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm just going to turn off my video. Yeah. So what types of new faculty support exist? So new faculty support at USC, at least, is in the terms of like travel funding. There's a Women in Science and Engineering fund that can also support travel. But every university is different. This is something, if your university has a mentoring program, that you should ask about. What do you wish you had known about departmental or academic politics before starting your first year? I feel like I've had to deal with a lot of it during my PhD, and it makes me worried I'm not cut out for academic science. Okay. So I also had to deal with a lot of it during my PhD. But I would say, if anything, that makes you better prepared to deal with it as a faculty member, because first off, you're asking the question, which means you're aware it exists. Whereas if you aren't aware it exists, then you kind of get blindsided when you come into a faculty position. And one thing you should, during the interview process, right, pay attention to how the faculty members are interacting with each other. Obviously that's very hard this year because there aren't meals. But one thing I was aware of when I went out for meals is, how did the faculty member talk to each other, right? Were they like joking around with each other? Did they know things about each other, right? Did they ask about each other's spouses? Did they ask about each other's children or dogs, or, just their personal life? Or were they only focused on science? Or did they just talk to me, which is even worse because it means they know nothing about each other. So, because I wanted to be in a department where it was like a family, right? Where everybody cared about each other, not just as scientists, but also as like whole people. So pay attention to how the faculty interact and engage with each other, not just with you, because they're all trying to recruit you. But once you're there, you want to be part of a team and integrated into a puzzle. But other panelists might have other opinions on politics. Okay. Or they might not want to go on the record. So when you ask for reference letters, do you ask for generic ones to use for all applications, or do you ask for tailored ones? So when you're asking for reference letters for faculty positions, you just ask for, will you write me a reference letter for a faculty position? And it's kind of up to your rec letter writers. What I did is I asked for reference letters for faculty positions, and I told my postdoc advisor that, my top school was X. And, I explained why. And so I know he kind of like tailored that letter to, indicate that, this was really my top school and all the other ones were kind of generic. Similarly, if you ask for rec letters for awards, you should give kind of a paragraph about why you are a good person for that award, right? So if it's a mentoring award, like why you're a good mentor. If it's a, whatever research award, like what research you've done that makes you ideally suited for that award. So help the rec letter writer help you, basically. Did you propose collaborations with department faculty you are applying to in your research proposal, even though you don't know the faculty? Yes. That's pretty easy, because you want to show how you're going to come into the department and contribute to the success of the department. How you're going to contribute to the success of the department is that, you as a piece are going to make the whole larger than the sum of the pieces. So you need to integrate. Yep, Mikhail?
Can I make a very quick comment
Yep.
about that? So I totally agree that you have to, it's really important to include collaborations and try to convince the department that you're going to fit in well and you're going to be, their colleague, and they're going to benefit not just personally, but like scientifically as well. But at the same time, I've always found it to be a little bit awkward to be like, I am going to collaborate with this person on this and this, and this person on this and this, and this person on this and this, when you don't know if those people are interested and you don't know them. And so I think there's a pretty easy intermediate path, which is to say something like, were I to join this department, I would be excited to collaborate with this person on this, and I would really benefit from this person's expertise. Like, there's a way to say it, which is essentially proposing collaborations without kind of like pushing it on people and sounding awkward. And so I just recommend finding that path.
Possibly
like
cover letter as opposed to the research statement.
Yeah, like I could potentially collaborate, or my research interests are complementary to, right. The other thing you should definitely say on this note of pointing out specifics are things like, my research will definitely benefit from the nanofabrication facility and the electron microscopy facility. So call out core user facilities at the research institution. Things not to do: don't show up on the day of the interview and say like, so does your school have a medical campus? Know things about the school. Don't show up and like not know big picture things about the school. Show up and be prepared. And I use that as an example because I experienced that with an interviewee. And not knowing if USC has a medical campus, has like a medical school, is a pretty big blunder. Okay, can you hold on? Okay. Did you get interviews at places which you thought from the beginning was a long shot in terms of fit? In other words, do you think there's a point applying to places that you don't think you'll be a perfect fit? Yes. I applied to places where I didn't think I would be a perfect fit. My degrees are in physics and applied physics, and I applied to a plethora of departments, including physics, but also BME, EE, Chemie, material science, and chemistry. And I got interviews and everything except for chemistry. So yes, apply even if the topic's totally different. Megan.
I just have a feedback on that of, if you know you will never live in that place, don't apply. So like if you really live in Michigan and you know that, then don't apply to jobs in Michigan. Although I can say for sure, Michigan's a great place to live.
Yeah, you really don't want to waste the time of the committee. I mean, they're spending, 1 out of potentially 5 interview slots, and don't agree entirely with Megan.
Yeah. I would also say if you know that, like after you get through the interview and the offer, if you know that you are definitely going to take an offer and somebody else comes in and offers you an interview, bye guys. Turn it down. Don't because it takes a university a really long time to make offers. So just respect the university, because remember, these people are going to be your colleagues forever, and you want them to like you. Okay, how would a new faculty go about becoming editors for journals, ad hoc reviewers for NIH, NSF, invited for talks? Does this rely entirely on your network or sending out cold emails? So most of my network I actually made while interviewing for positions, right? So view your interviews as, starting to establish your network outside of your, PhD and postdoc advisors. So my network went up by a factor of 10 while I was interviewing for positions. So that's like step one. Stay in contact with these people you meet, because they're in your department, they're at other schools, and they can start inviting you for things. And then step 2, cold emails, and get used to having your emails not returned. Just get used to it. But yeah, so those are the 2 paths I found. Any other paths?
I think Twitter is great too, for like expanding that and continuing those things.
How do you organize and keep track of funding? How much you spend, how much is left, how long it'll last? Was that something you had to learn on the job? Yes, you have to learn it on the job. And different universities, yeah, it's horrible. And different universities have different mechanisms in place. So some will give you like an admin or a budget business analyst is what that position is called at USC. Some will have the financial analyst independent from the staff position, so it'll be a dedicated person. Some funding agencies require like monthly updates, so it's dependent on the funding agency, but yes, it's something you learn on the job, and it's painful. I hope this isn't too late. I was wondering how search committees view positive recommendation letters from someone in your field who is not a direct advisor or collaborator, but who knows you and appreciates your work. So positive recommendation letters are always good. They're never viewed negatively. The fact that it's not a direct advisor or collaborator is also always good. I would say that, at least in my experience, the more detailed the recommendation letter is, then the more power it holds, because that indicates that they actually know you. So the general rule of thumb is that you can get a recommendation letter from a Nobel laureate, but if it just says, X person did great work, period, that's not super helpful, even though it's from a really famous person. But if you get a recommendation letter from an assistant professor that's 5 pages long and details every single part of your life, and describes exactly what you did and how you did it and why you're a great fit, that's much more powerful, because it shows that they actually know you and they can actually describe everything fabulous about you. So it's not so much who they are, what their relationship is, it's the quality of the recommendation letter. That's my personal experience. Megan and Bryan, you may have different thoughts, but you're nodding, so okay. So think about the quality of the letter a person's gonna be able to write. Do you have any advice or notes or tips that need to be paid attention to closely during social events, lunch, dinner, between interviews? So how people interact with each other, how people treat you, how people treat waiters. I went on one interview and a person ordered a salmon salad, and the salmon salad came, but the salad was on the side, and the faculty member had a meltdown, like a total meltdown. And I was just like, oh my God. Okay, so that person, yeah. Yeah, I was like, it's still a salmon salad. It's salmon with salad. But anyway. So what role does the diversity statement play in the application or interview process in your department? This is very variable. I know in my department, it's really important, but especially right now. And that's simply because of the current makeup of the search committee. Everybody who's on the search committee really values diversity. We really value diversity statements. We also really value the sincerity of the diversity statement. We don't view it as just a placeholder. But I cannot speak to that as a universal opinion, and I wouldn't begin to. But Megan and Bryan, do you have other comments? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to be authentic in those. And yeah, your point is perfect, Andrew.
I think that you also need to have a plan for increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion laid out in those statements as well. I mean, they have to be solid, and it has to show a commitment, a dedication to how you're going to improve DEI in your in the department. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what other kinds of soft money should we know about? So this really depends on the institution. At USC, there's the internal soft money. So there's a lot of funds that people can apply for internally. My piece of advice to assistant professors is that any undergrad research fellowship they should nominate their students for and apply for, because all of those little tiny pots of $3,000 add up to be an entire NSF grant, except there's no overhead on it, so it's even better. So, even though it seems like a small amount of money, like why are you going to write for a $3,000 undergrad research fellowship, first off, it's an award for your undergrad. It's a paragraph, like really, you don't have time to write a paragraph. And then the success rate's like 100%. So why would you not write that? So that's my piece of advice. Like apply for all funding that's internal to the university because it doesn't take very long.
Aside on that is also there's, depending on which institution you go to or what state it's in, there's money, not necessarily soft money, but there are something I didn't know about before I became faculty was the EPSCoR or INBRE states. So like Delaware was one of these smaller populations states. I think Alaska and Montana have these as well. They have like special pots of money from NIH and NSF and the Department of Energy and things like that to support research more locally, which can really help get a research program off the ground too.
Yeah, California doesn't have that. Okay, so then the last question, how do you decide between recruiting masters, PhD, all of that? So I just wanted to touch on this in terms of undergrads. So I'm a huge fan of recruiting undergrads. Undergrads bring a certain flavor to the lab. Undergrads are, and I don't have undergrads wash glassware. Undergrads are particularly fearless in doing research. And I think that's a really important element, especially for an assistant professor. So you can give undergrads a project that perhaps someone who knows better, like a PhD student or a postdoc, they wouldn't do the project because they would, be able to look at the math and say, oh, the probability of this project working is like 2%. But an undergrad is just super excited to be in the lab. So they will try it. And because their mindset is that, it should work, they will keep trying it until like they've tried it so many different ways and so many times that like you can be confident it doesn't work. Whereas if you go into a project with the mindset that it shouldn't work, I will guarantee you it won't work because you already have that mindset that it's not going to work. So I have given undergrads projects that, the PhD student declined to do. The undergrad did, it worked. And then suddenly the PhD student was like, oh, so about that data. So it's really important to, think about your undergrads as your, explorers, right? Like they're the ones that can take on the high risk projects because if it doesn't work, they're still getting research experience. And if it does work, they could be launching a new line of research for your lab. And they don't cost as much. So the salary investment isn't gigantic. So that's in my lab, that's where the undergrads fit in. They're like, the SEAL team doing the exploratory research, really like targeting the high risk, crazy ideas. And if they fail, it's fine. They still learned how to use a UV vis and an NMR. So they still get really great experience and become great grad students. Okay, so that's all the questions. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bryan and Megan, for hanging out for the last, half hour. And I'm sorry my video died. I'm not surprised. It's Pasadena. So I hope everyone found this helpful.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.
Bye. We'll try again. Bye-bye.